All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Doman. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Campbell Security. And before that, I worked on AV Vault's Open Threat Exchange that you might have seen before, also another portal called ThreatCrowd. But before all that, I used to work in incident response at PwC, working for this guy, James.
Thanks, Chris. I'm this guy, James. James Campbell, CEO and co-founder of Campbell Security. Long-time cyber incident response and forensics buff and self-confessed nerd. I previously, before Cato, I used to run the cyber incident response team at PwC UK. And before coming over to the UK, I used to run the IR side of things in Australian government at the Australian Signals Directorate. Great. So thanks for joining today. So let's get into it. So as per our website, here's a description of our presentation. But we know people don't like to read the whole thing, so we've been nice here, and I've distilled this down into kind of some key messages here and some things that we're going to talk about today on the agenda. And really, it's about a story, and a story about our interactions with a hacker group known as Team TNT, and a story around the compromise of Kubernetes systems, particularly in cloud environments. There's also a little bit of a twist with some weird GIFs we've come across, and just for a bit of laughter as well, which is great. But at the end, we're also going to make sure that we've got some key take-homes for you and some advice around actually protecting yourself, particularly when it comes to vulnerable Kubernetes platforms. So over to Chris to kind of start off the story for Cato.
Yeah, so this is how our story begins. So one day, I think back in August 2020, I was looking at our usual feed of malware coming through every day, lots of stuff in there. And this one kind of caught my eye. It's got a really cool logo on it. You can see there, it says Team TNT. And at this point, I didn't know what that meant. No one had really reported on them yet. But digging in, it looked kind of interesting. So this is what it was doing. And this is what really kind of got us interested. So you can see here what the script is doing is it's taking the root AWS credentials file and it's sending off to the attacker server, which is that URL ending with the PHP script. And what the AWS credential file can do is a ton of stuff, actually. So it contains your access key, as you can see here. It contains your secret key. And an attacker can take this, they can sit at their laptop, and if that credential has access, they can go and do things like download all the files from S3, they can start and stop EC2 instances. So tons of different things they can potentially do here. And looking at the network PCAP here, which is what that script sends over, in red is what gets sent to the attacker server, and then in blue is what the attacker server sends back. You can see in response to that stolen data, it just says thanks.
Very nice of them.
Yeah, it was very nice of them. So I started looking around the server a little bit more, and I could see here that there are some more files. So it was an open directory. I can see there's this PHP script, which is stealing those creds. There's also kube-in as well, which is stealing Kubernetes credentials, something we'll talk about in a minute. And there's some other open directories too, which is potentially quite interesting. But the next folder I looked at had this message instead. Don't even try little noob you. So clearly these guys can protect their servers a little bit to stop you looking around. Next server had this. Stop it now, quite a clear directive on that folder.
I think at this point, they definitely don't want you looking around, that's for sure.
Yeah, I don't think they like the researchers poking their servers much. And then just to kind of set the scene here, this is around 1 in the morning. I was looking at this server, looking at this malware. So I was sitting back in my chair, headphones full blast, listening to some music, came across this instead. It says activate sound, but it plays anyway.
Access granted. Access denied. Access denied. Access denied.
So I guess a pretty clear message that they didn't want people looking around their server. And then finally in the next folder on this server, I'm not even sure how to describe this one, James.
He's high-fiving himself, but thank you for marketing on putting in the box in there. We really appreciate it. But we'll move on.
Working out just the right size.
We'll move on quickly from this one.
Yeah, move on to that. So what we did next is what any good starter would do is we wrote this up in the blog post to kind of get this news out there. And we wrote this post In it, we're talking about the malware. We're talking about how it does that kind of AWS cred theft we were talking about earlier. You can see here as well, we include a screenshot of their homepage because these attackers, Team TNT, do actually have their own official homepage. And at this point, the homepage has some quite nice advice actually for victims. It was saying things like, here are some free sandboxes to analyze our malware with. Here's some other kind of stuff you should know too. And when we did publish this, it got quite a lot of attention because, as we said before, no one else had kind of covered this AWS cred theft kind of method, particularly when it came to worms doing it like this. But then the next day, I think after we posted this, we got this somewhat strange post comment on our blog post.
Yeah, this one was an interesting one. You don't often get a situation where hackers actually send you a message. And in this case, we thought we'd share it because they actually were wondering whether or not we would. And I'll read out a little bit for you. So they said, "You're confusing yourself, free your mind. By the way, because of your posting," and a whole bunch of ASCII text, which obviously probably means that they were a bit frustrated by our post. What you are doing here is advertising at the expense of others. Now, I'm assuming others means attackers because we had quite a lot of people actually thank us for their posts because it helped them find some malicious activity on their Kubernetes environments. But on a positive note, it was really nice of them to finish some of these sentences with sorry. So they are trying to be polite, which is nice. And of course, they were quite curious whether or not we would post this comment. So we've done one better. We've talked about it at Black Hat now. So definitely posted that comment, considered that ticked. And then they sign off with best regards. So, they're trying their best to be formal and nice, at least at some point. So we had to go away and think about whether or not we were actually going to respond to this, which was an interesting thought.
Yeah, and I was kind of going back and checking their web server because it had new malware on. And the next time we saw it, it had this reference to us on it, actually.
Yeah, quite nice of them.
So in response, we had to send them an email saying that, try and set the record clear here. And James wrote this email to them.
Yeah, and I think one of the points they pointed out in their own comment was that they thought we had one component wrong in our blog. So we wanted to actually ask them, why was it wrong and show them our analysis. And indeed, if it was wrong, then we would update the blog and post their comment if they wanted to. So we thought that was only fair to go back with our thoughts. And so I said, thank you for taking the time to write to us. Any comments are greatly appreciated. We definitely appreciate your update based on the point they were trying to make. And so in a very fact-based way, we said, here's the way we explain our analysis here. And we also point out to you some of the other research that's been done. We said, we'd love to hear your thoughts and confirm the above and get your perspective on this. And of course, if there's something wrong, we'll be happy to go and make a correction and update our blog ASAP. Thanks for reaching out. We look forward to hearing back. Now, we didn't get an email back, but they did make an update, at least, I guess, on their site, didn't they, Chris?
Yeah, so they changed it straight away back to this, which doesn't mention us anymore and just says that they're going to go to sleep and you won't see their malware anymore.
Yeah, very, very odd. And they were, it did kind of start a trend, didn't it, Chris, of them talking to other researchers as well.
Yeah, following on from this, a lot of other people had contact from them, I think.
Yeah, very peculiar, but interesting nonetheless. Great. So we're going to talk a little bit now about how they do exploitation and command and control, etc., and kind of get into some of the tooling. But before I kick that off, we often obviously pull together different scenarios and case studies. We run simulations as well to make sure, we ourselves understand how to do forensics on compromised environments. And in one particular case, we pulled together a case study around vulnerable Kubernetes environments. And this was for a different conference. If you want to see this data, it's actually online, free to the community. If you want to have your hand at Kubernetes forensics, we put a whole bunch of stuff on GitHub and on our webpage. Please do go check it out. And as part of this, you always wonder, have I set up this environment in a way where hackers do actually compromise it? And also have I simulated the same sort of events that an attacker would do? Well, we've got a pretty good verification of this because We stood up this Kubernetes kind of case study early in the morning. We spent a few hours running our simulation, so compromising in a way that a normal attacker would. And then we did a forensic capture of the node, only to find out that 30 minutes later, Team TNT just compromised the exact same node, which was kind of annoying because it polluted our environment that we were trying to do for a case study in another conference. So that was quite a funny one. But, case in point, they compromised it in the same way. They did the same thing that our simulation did as well. So that was great validation for us. But also raises a really important point here. We only had this environment online for a day, and we were keeping an eye on it, of course. And then within that day, it got compromised. And so, this is a really good point to highlight. If you do have kind of misconfigured Kubernetes clusters out there or vulnerable Kubernetes clusters, and they're public facing, the chances are they're probably already compromised. So just food for thought there that it literally happens that quickly. So an interesting one nonetheless. Now, if you do need to go out and analyze your systems, if you're just rushed out the door because you've seen that slide, I don't blame you. But if you do need to have a look, there are plenty of log files that Kubernetes generates and Docker generates as well, which help you identify if you've been compromised. But not only that, you do need to kind of dive deep and do a little bit more forensic so you can truly understand the risk. And if you do that, we recommend doing that on the Kubernetes node. We like to highlight this because some people just look at the actual containers themselves. You do need to look at the node as well. It gives you some extra logging information. There's also kind of file system versioning, kind of foo happening too, which actually helps you with your analysis and work out what's going on. So just some food for thought there when it comes to forensic analysis. Again, loads of stuff on our GitHub page and stuff you can check out that will help with that, hopefully. Now, kind of moving on from that, and it's like, what are you looking for and how do they get in? Well, again, it kind of revolves around open APIs. Now, the actual attackers, they say this wasn't a worm. I'll let everybody on the internet decide whether or not it's a worm, but I feel like it's a little bit of like a worm function. So essentially what happens is the attackers scan an IP range, they see open APIs, they compromise those machines, and then they do the same thing again. So that now compromised machine goes again, scans new IP ranges, and then compromises those, and so on. And so, I don't know, it kind of sounds like a worming function. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, kind of.
Kind of. What do we know? So it does start with the Kubernetes APIs. And what happens is that these are unauthenticated APIs that are public facing, with no kind of allow listing in place. And these attackers are running a number of shell commands. We've distilled just some of it down here for you on the screen. So they'll run a bunch of shell commands. They'll bring down some scripts and run some things. One of them is mass scan. So they'll go and do mass scan across other public IP ranges. The one interesting point here as well is that they'll also look at your LAN ranges as well, so your local network ranges. So the chances are if you've got one compromised Kubernetes node, you probably have others. So by that virtue. So definitely need to go and have a look at your entire estate at that point, because the chances are they're probably all configured very similar, or if not the same. And then they do actually pick on Docker APIs as well. So do keep an eye out for that in addition to that, and in addition to Kubernetes. And then one of the cool things they do, and shout out to them, is that they don't just go off and scan the entire internet. The workers that are compromised will actually communicate to the attacker's server. They'll actually get whatever the latest IP block range they're meant to be scanning, just so there's not a repetition there and it's a bit more efficient. So very smart. This is actually public as well. So they actually publicly publish how many infected devices they have at any one moment. They're a little bit weird, but kind of interesting as well. And I guess they got a cool logo too. Chris, I like a bit of ASCII art. Yeah, I like a bit of ASCII art. So it is quite peculiar that they're very public and very interesting on that front. So you saw that it was like 6,000 odd compromised systems in that screenshot. There were a lot of people having problems with this. And definitely back in the day when we first started noticing this activity, there was lots of chatter on forums and stuff. I think there was a bit of education needed to kind of get some information out there to let people know how these compromises were occurring, because they didn't all understand what was going on. And they were like, I locked down SSH and all these things, like how are these things happening? And so again, another reason why we're here to try and help, raise awareness and get people to protect themselves. This one is a little bit funny as well. If you can say compromise is funny, but it is a little bit funny that the attackers actually set up a user account in their own names. So that was an interesting one from a post that we saw on the forum. Yeah, a bit cheeky of them, bit cheeky.
I like that one.
Yeah, exactly. Chris, over to you for the command and control side.
All right, cool. So how do Team TNT maintain access to these networks after they compromise them? One of the ways they do it is through their ISE bots. So pretty classic stuff. They use the Tsunami ISE bot, and it just works, which is, I guess, the reason they've been using it for so long. And the way they do it,
a bit of old school ISE, Chris. It's old school, but it's always cool. It's cool to still see it kicking around.
More ASCII out there, as you can see on the Team TNT ISE hub.
Way to my heart.
So I connected into their server last week, and you can see here 221 clients connected in. So that's 220 victims and one attacker as well. And also you can look on the right side there, has a decompiled IP address as well. So that's how they connect in, and they can point it directly there.
Sorry, getting ahead of myself there, Chris. There you go.
All right. Also, they use WeaveScope, which is a perfectly legitimate Kubernetes administration tool. And the cool thing about WeaveScope is that you've got this beautiful kind of graphical interface. So you can go and you can kind of click stuff and start and stop containers. And they actually install this on the hosts after they compromise them. And the other thing they do as well is they will actually look for open WeaveScope installations and just connect and compromise that way too. There are actually a ton of other backdoors they do as well. So I won't go through all of these because they're generally the same as other crypto mining worms. The one that I will pull out here is Teammate. And Teammate is a lot like Tmux, if you've ever used that one before. So if you're a Linux user, you might have used Tmux. It means that I can sit on my laptop, you're on your laptop, we can kind of both type and do some screen sharing stuff. And Teammate is a bit like Tmux, but it can tunnel through NATs and do some other stuff that makes it a bit easier to deploy. So how did Team TNT do Privesk? Well, if you remember right at the beginning of the talk, we were showing how they were stealing some AWS credential files. They still do that, but they're actually a lot more sophisticated 1 year on than they were back then. So here we can see that they're stealing at the top of this script the environment variables of the system. So there are passwords there. And then just after that, they're stealing the Docker environment variables. So that's actually pretty similar to the other environment variables, but really important if you're attacking Kubernetes systems. And at the bottom of this script, they're still stealing the root AWS credentials files, but now they're cleaning them up a bit, they're grepping them out, they're kind of doing some templating, so getting a little bit more sophisticated there too. And then this is pretty unique as well, actually. So what they do now, as of a few months ago, is they'll scrape the AWS metadata URL. So they'll hit that magic IP address there, 169. whatever. And what that gives you is things like what region you're running in, but also things like the secret key and the access key, and a ton of kind of other data as well around your system. And if you can remember the Capital One breach, that was actually really a big part of that too. With Capital One, the attacker stole the creds from the metadata URL and at their laptop pulled down some really sensitive information from S3. And then finally, at the bottom of this, you'll see another magic IP address, and that is the Amazon Elastic Kubernetes Service IP. They're hitting that to also steal credentials there too. So some more kind of Amazon Kubernetes specific stuff they're coming out with now too. And it's not just AWS. So here we can see Team TNT stealing a ton of credential files, including the GCP, so Google Cloud credential files. There's other stuff there too, like the SSH keys. There's things like FileZilla. So tons of stuff they steal now. And just in case Azure was feeling left out, they now support Azure as well, or they're about to. So they actually give a heads up of what's about to happen often from their official Twitter account.
It's really nice of them to give them a heads up. Again, another kind of odd thing, isn't it, Chris? Like, they're very vocal, but it's nice of them to give researchers a heads up that they're about to target Azure. So it's more like a product support announcement, isn't it? Yeah, very odd.
They are a lot more chatty than your average group of hackers. And just going through just a couple of these. So here they replied to some researchers saying that they're finding it really tough now because AWS is recognizing when they're stealing those keys really quickly. So good work from AWS there. And then sometimes it's just weird. They have like a fan club on Twitter now as well. So OMG, hacker family, all that kind of stuff.
It's sad sometimes, isn't it? But funny.
It's funny, yeah. And then here are a few other ways to do Priv-esque as well. So one kind of smart thing they do is they use a tool called Docker Escape off of GitHub.
I love the name. It does what it says on the tin.
Yeah, it's pretty, what it does is it escapes from Docker. And they do that through some sockets. So there are some network sockets and file sockets they use to break out, also some particular exploits as well. And what they've done there is they've uploaded it to Docker Hub. So it's just easier to deploy straight as a container. And full credit here to Aquasec for finding this one first. Another tool they run is called Break Out the Box, or BOTB. And you can kind of see from the command they're running here what it does. So it scrapes Google Cloud credentials, some other metadata too, also steals some Kubernetes secrets as well. And then we've got Payrates. And Payrates is quite similar to Break Out the Box, actually. It also has some kind of cloud and container specific attacks. And then this is my favorite one. So if you've ever used Infection Monkey before, Infection Monkey is kind of like a friendly AWS worm. You deploy it in your account, you set up an Infection Monkey server, and then it tunnels through your account and it will tell you like what credentials are insecure. It kind of works its way through and gives you a really nice kind of heads up there. But what Team TNT were doing for a little while, and this is spotted by Tencent, is they were actually running their own Infection Monkey server, compromising other people's networks, and then pointing this back at their server to try and get some more information around the networks. That was kind of an odd one. And we've gone through kind of a couple of the tools that they use, but there's actually so much more if we had time to go into it. So this is a screenshot of one of the folders from one of their servers showing some of their custom tooling. And some of the other things that they're doing here, they're doing things like cleaning up old logs, they're SSH break forcing, they're exploiting Redis systems, and installing some custom drivers as well. There's a ton of different stuff these guys do, actually. And at the end of the talk, we include some references. So if you're interested in what else they do, there's a lot more to hear about.
Cool, thanks, Chris. I think it goes without saying, they're very vocal. There's lots of information online. Just be careful if you go poking around. Then make sure you know what you're doing. Don't go just clicking on stuff because you might end up being compromised yourself. So just like a be careful at home kids kind of message before people go jump out and look at those IPs and everything and links we've just put on the slides. So next bit is kind of like, why are they doing this, right? And unfortunately, the first answer to that is not very sexy, but pretty obvious. The second answer to that is more around like, what could you do? And that's the scarier one. And we wanted to make sure we kind of touched on that in our presentation, make sure we kind of get, some of this information out there. And again, have people kind of looking into their Kubernetes configurations and their environments to make sure they protect themselves from such attacks. And so the first reason is, well, they do it for crypto mining. Yeah, I know, not too exciting, right? And we all know crypto mining on CPUs, particularly, in containers, is probably not the most efficient option. But they do have quite a lot of machines. So, you know what, maybe it is. Maybe they do get a little bit of something out of it. But I think what I'm more concerned about is what could actually happen. And as you saw before, they go ahead and steal credentials, whether they be in AWS or GCP, and, Azure coming soon, right? And so, what could you be doing with that sort of information, which people might not be seeing or is yet to happen? And a lot of people kind of think of that whole "it won't happen to me" thing, but I put this one in here because if you have been compromised by a crypto mining worm in your Kubernetes environment, and that was the only thing that happened, I would consider that very much a shot over the bows and consider yourself lucky. So make sure you have gone and actually remediated what the underlying root cause was, an issue there, and you've investigated and done some forensics around that. So let's kind of talk a little bit more scary then. What could actually happen? Well, let's start on the Kubernetes side, so on the nodes themselves and kind of risks that it could represent. Well, one of the ones which seems the most obvious is data exfil. So a lot of these containers have access to databases with sensitive information or file shares. And so an attacker could obviously spend a little bit more time on these containers and actually start stealing some data. And then that can even lead to ransom, to holding your data to ransom or looking to disrupt your system. So, they have to spend a little bit more time to do this, but if they do, it can have a big effect. And the other thing as well is it's quite hard to spot. A lot of people don't tend to do investigations when it involves containers and Kubernetes. They especially find it hard to dive in deep on the forensics side. So that's something that we do need to start doing more and more, in order to find kind of what the underlying root causes are and the actual risk that's happening, rather than just crypto mining, running, and then blowing it away. The one that's really scary as well is, a lot of these containers run kind of web apps or, web services, and, you could inject some code in there. You could be running drive-by downloads. The world is your oyster, right? You could go ahead and corrupt data and, and therefore potentially compromise your users. So now you are the third-party risk as a result of your compromised Kubernetes environment. So food for thought there. Now, the more kind of even more scary side, and not to be too scary, I guess, but it is scary and it is something that can happen and may have already happened. We just haven't seen it. Is with those credentials they're stealing, you can potentially use that to spin up or even destroy resources as well. So I've definitely seen GPU resources being spun up, used for crypto mining. That's a little bit more obvious when your account starts draining full of credits. But, when it comes to destroying resources, there's also something to consider as well. That could be quite disruptive. You could also use those credentials to access other parts of the environment. What happens is that a lot of customers and people out there are setting up these environments and AWS credentials and GCP credentials with excess privileges. And part of the reason of that is because identity and access management is hard. And it's definitely hard for cloud as well. It's very complicated. And there's lots of solutions out there to kind of help with that, which I won't go into. But one part of that is the fact that the reason why it's hard, or because it's hard, is people just want things to work, and so they add excess privileges to those accounts just to make things work, and that presents the risk. Lets people access other parts of the environment, etc. And the same goes with those creds. You can even create accounts, and we actually did a case study where we proved you could use those privileges and stuff like that to create accounts, and then that can actually lead to console access, which is pretty crazy, right? Like if you can think about an attacker creating an account and then accessing your AWS or your Azure or your GCP console, no matter what endpoint solution you're running across your cloud estate, you're not going to spot that. And they could go in and they could disrupt things or hold that account to ransom, you name it, like the world is your oyster as an attacker at that point. Is this happening? We're not sure. Has it happened? We're not sure either, but certainly it's probably happened to some extent. It's just that people don't investigate deep enough to actually see this happening. And that's where you need to actually do forensics on your Kubernetes environments. And you also need to do forensics on your cloud data as well, and actually start piecing together this pie. But something to be aware of and something that you should look to protect yourself against. But you know what? It sounds very doom and gloom. Ironically, like a lot of things, there's some quite simple ways you can do to kind of protect yourself against this. And so this is something we were kind of wanted to, finish up on, just to make sure you had some key takeaways to go home and make sure that you're in the right state. And so it sounds all basic. but there are people not doing this. And the first one is secure your API. And so that's about setting up authentication, but not just that, but doing things like allow listing and firewall rule sets, just to make sure that only the machines and the servers or parts of the network that are required to talk to your API do, and not just the whole entire internet, which is not a great thing. And then the other one as well is, we say AWS credentials here. It's just it's just because we looked at AWS a lot. This also reflects on GCP and Azure as well. Make sure your credential usage is proper and correct in your containers. A lot of people don't think this is a problem because containers spin up and down. So therefore, the data is going to disappear and it's not a security risk. It absolutely is a security risk. So make sure you're using credentials in a safe manner in your containers. And where you do have to use credentials, make sure you are assigning least privilege and make sure those privileges are only doing specifically what you need them to do. They don't need admin access to your entire estate. Like, why the hell you need credentials to the point where you can, create an account in the console? That's pretty crazy too. So, it's food for thought there. Definitely some pretty obvious ones around reviewing network traffic. So look for mining pools and mining protocols. This goes for on-prem as well as cloud as well. So just keeping an eye out for that. This one's a bit of a cheeky recommendation. Like, obviously, if you see your credentials flying out through HTTP, that's usually a bad sign, but that's what happens. So we put it in there. And then some other ones around general kind of things that you should be doing anyway. So you're not using passwords and using key files, etc., and locking down your remote access. And then the one that's a bit of a bugbear for me, just because I come across so many compromises with customers over, the last 10 years or so, where people forget about the developer and test environments. And, they tend to have quite good controls over the production environments. And they're quite locked down, and a lot of the assessment tends to happen around production only when it comes to pen testing and stuff like that. But they never think about the developer environments and the test environments. And those are just as vulnerable, if not even more vulnerable, because they tend to have excess privileges, tend to be a bit more Wild West. So make sure you're keeping an eye out for those, because those can lead to potential access to your production environment as well. So, and also have sensitive data in there too. So there's some key kind of takeaways. Some of them seem quite basic, but if I'm honest, sometimes it only takes basic things to solve these problems. It does play in part that there is complexity to the cloud. And so you need to make the cloud less complex in order to understand, to introduce these basic things. But just in wrapping up, we do want to kind of acknowledge some of the excellent research that's been out there. So ever since we started doing research on Team TNT, there's been loads of great kind of blogs and articles and knowledge sharing. So we thought we'd give a shout out here. And you know what? Just because they've been a good character so far in communications with us, we've given a shout out to the attackers too down the bottom. And then I think that's it. We move over to Q&A. Thank you.